Now we're up to the third part of a discussion of Camus' The Rebel. So just to briefly recapitulate what we said last week, the rebel he defines as someone who may have always been quite willing to do what he's told by his boss or his government or his captain or his even slave owner, unless and until he's required to do something which goes against his own values. And at that time he must and will refuse to do that, and then he becomes a rebel. And then when Camus was talking about what he called metaphysical insurrection or metaphysical rebellion, he says that that thing which is against one's values, that he regards as the most important one, is this condition, again, that he's called the absurd, that meaning the condition where human beings come into being, have consciousness, have an awareness, and then have it all taken away from them. And that's not acceptable, he says, and it's all God's fault, he says, really, because for one of two reasons: either because God doesn't exist when he perhaps should have, or because he does exist, but then rather negligently or possibly maliciously has created that terrible situation for human beings, and so we have to rebel against it. So that's basically what he means. So we're in a state where he regards man as having to rebel. And what form does that rebellion take? So Camus says that the best way to rebel is to live in total freedom. So one does whatever one wants to. You don't do anything because you're told to or forced to or paid to, or because you feel guilty and feel that you should. If you do it for any of those reasons, then you're really not free. You're being, some force is being brought to bear on you to do it. To be truly free means just to do exactly what you want to do, what gives you pleasure, and to do only that, to never do anything except what you really feel like doing and what you're really going to enjoy all the time. So if you can live totally for pleasure all the time, he says, then you are really free. And being free is, he says, the only real way that one can rebel against this condition that we're in. So to live totally for one's pleasure all the time and only for one's pleasure, the examples that he brings forward are perhaps somewhat unfortunate. He particularly talks about the Marquis de Sade, whose name we know has been adopted to describe that condition of enjoying hurting people, torturing people. But he says the Marquis de Sade did whatever he wanted to do, even these extreme things. No one stopped him. It might be outrageous to many people, but he just did it. And so Camus sees him as an example of a metaphysical rebel who's just living totally for his own pleasure. And most people, fortunately, do not want to hurt people and do not derive any pleasure from hurting people at all, but Sade apparently did. So he uses him as an example of that, and that brings to light also, I mean, this is not in Camus' book, but it's just thinking about it from my point of view, it also brings to mind someone like Aleister Crowley, the famous sorcerer and worker of spells in the 20th century, who took as his motto something like, do what thou wilt, I think it is, that is all the law. So you just do whatever you like all the time. And that's apparently was de Sade's point of view, and that's what Camus is saying is the way to rebel. So he's kind of in rather unfortunate company, and Camus doesn't come across as being that sort of a person, a kind of a evil, cruel person at all, but his philosophy seems to force him to move in those circles, at least intellectually. So if one is going to live always seeking one's own pleasure at all times, then, Camus says, inevitably one will come up against the law, because some of those things one wants to do are illegal in our society. And so he confesses that, yes, if one's going to live that way, one must live outside the law. So the rebel seeking total freedom is going to become someone who's outside the law. And there will probably be circumstances when he might even want to murder somebody. He might want something that's going to give him pleasure and enjoyment. Somebody else may not want to give it to him. And so one might be forced to kill that person. And that might be part of the requirements of this rebellion. And that actually brings up yet one more Dostoevsky character. So when we've been looking at the myth of Sisyphus and the outsider, Camus mentioned Stavrogin and Kirillov from Dostoevsky's The Possessed, Ivan Karamazov from the Brothers Karamazov, Ippolit, and another character we mentioned but didn't give his name, Prince Mishkin from Dostoevsky's novel The Idiot. He's talked about all of those. And also then, of course, the character of Raskolnikov comes up from Crime and Punishment, which is probably Dostoevsky's most read book. And the whole plot of that novel revolves around the fact that Raskolnikov, a young poor student, thinks a bit like Camus' rebel, well, life has no real meaning, there's nothing that stops us doing anything. What's going to stop me from doing whatever I want to do? I'm in need of money at the moment. There's this old woman, money lender, who's got heaps of money. No one likes her. She's a miserable old person who doesn't enjoy life, and she's just sitting on all this money when other people like myself could be using it. So why don't I kill her? What's to stop me? And it would be good for me because I'll have money, I'll be able to do the things I want. And there's no reason at all why I shouldn't do it. So he does do it, he kills her. And the rest of the novel concerns how he comes to realise, well, actually it does matter. And goes through all that process of working through that, why it really does matter. So Camus uses all these Dostoevsky characters. I think he's got to the point where some of the characters were, but he hasn't really got to the point where Dostoevsky was. Like, he's almost saying, Raskolnikov is right, just do that because you want to, because it's going to be useful, because you want to live free in this brief interlude of life that we have. But he doesn't seem to have come to the point where Dostoevsky is saying, he's criticising that point of view, and he's saying Raskolnikov found out, no, that doesn't work at all. There's lots of reasons why he can't do that. Anyway, so this metaphysical rebel is demonstrating his freedom by taking every pleasure he possibly can, even though that might take him outside the law, even though that might involve him in murder, is living that way. But as Camus points out, if once one has allowed murder, then one allows that for everybody. So I might encounter somebody else who's living for his own pleasure, and he might bump into me and want something from me, and he might decide to murder me. So Camus acknowledges that could be a problem. So that leads on then to the thought that it's really a question of who is the stronger. The one who's going to live free, who's going to live for his pleasure, has to be strong enough to overcome our enemies and to defend himself. So then you get to a kind of a society like in a cowboy film or in a medieval knight story or a Japanese samurai story. The person who's got the best weapons and got the most skill in using them is the one who's going to be able to do whatever he likes, and is going to be able to fight off the people who might want to take him down. So you're getting back to that kind of society. But then that creates its own kind of an aristocracy then. The people, like the knights, medieval knights, were basically the people who became the rulers of the whole society. And Camus approaches that too, when he's starting to talk, he moves on to some extent to criticise the politics and history of the time, the first half and the middle of the 20th century, and the mass murder that came out of that. And as we mentioned before, there was a big dispute between himself and Sartre about whether that was something that was acceptable or not. But what he's saying now would suggest that these totalitarian dictatorships should have existed and flourished, but is that really what he meant? Anyway, so he talks about, there's some interesting quotes about this. So this is on page 41 of the Penguin edition of The Rebel. He says, "One must kill again and again. The masters will destroy each other in their turn." So that is certainly something that happened in the USSR, that a small elite group took power ostensibly in the name of the people, but actually really it was a small group, a political group, and then a small inner group of that political party, and then a smaller inner group again of that inner group that possessed all the power, and they started killing off all their enemies, from the history of what happened in the Soviet Union. And then again on page 42 he says, the extreme consequences of a rebel's logic, so that's the logic he's been talking about, the extreme consequences of a rebel's logic are a hermetic totalitarianism, universal crime, an aristocracy of cynicism, and a desire for an apocalypse. They will be found again many years after his death. So looking at the USSR again, we've talked about how the masters destroy each other in turn. A hermetic totalitarianism, that could certainly describe the USSR, a state that had an iron border around it, no one could get in or out, shut itself off from the rest of the world. Universal crime, well, they just stole everything from everybody and put people in prison and killed them at will. An aristocracy of cynicism. So that kind of talks about, we were talking about the samurai code or the knightly code. The people that have got the most skill in defending themselves and fighting and killing are the ones that become the aristocracy. In those societies that was the case, but also in the Soviet Union and in Orwell's 1984, the inner party is this aristocratic elite group, but they don't even really believe in they don't believe at all in what they're professing to believe in. An aristocracy of cynicism. The desire for an apocalypse, I'm not sure if that was something that existed in the Soviet Union or not really. He says they will be found again many years after his death. So the person who's set out on this road of metaphysical rebellion that Camus is talking about and possibly is advocating, I'm not sure if he's advocating or just describing it. And there were people in the 19th century, as we've seen from Dostoevsky's novels, who had set out on that path. And those consequences were found again many years after their death. So in the Soviet Union, for example.